talked so far also almost exclusively about commercial. You've talked about potential bubbles. I'd just like to put a question to the panel across Europe. Is residential going to be a saviour to the markets across Europe in any way, excluding central London?
Can I start with London, maybe? That clearly one of the influences in London in the last 10 years has been the rise in residential values. So a lot of landlords in central London are finding that their property is far more valuable as a house or flats than it is as offices. And there's been, this, of course, this change of use, which has reduced some of the supply, particularly in the West End. We'll come on to it later. I think it's the 500 million euro question about where to put money in. And I think one of the things is that transport hubs and younger people wanting to work and live closer together, in my view, across Europe, means I think the city centres and around city centres where you've got good transport are going to become more attractive for residential schemes.
If you will, a lot of the commercial value fall at the moment in conversion to residential. You're reducing the supply of the maybe non-needed commercial. Is there going to be enough demand for the residential? Just across Europe, just as the panel's thoughts.
I'm going to pass to my right now. I think from London's point of view, I think residential values are holding up pretty well. If I may just say one thing on that.
Yep.
We're advising a major Chinese investment bank, and they're coming into Europe, and they've got three areas of the world they want to invest in. One is Asia, obviously. Secondly is America, and in America it's just the West Coast, where you have large Chinese populations. So it's Vancouver, San Francisco, etc. And in Europe it's just one city, and we're in it now. It's London, and it's residential, student accommodation, then commercial. And I find that interesting how a major Chinese fund with big ambitions to put money into Europe are only focusing on residential in London. But I think, again, London, I don't think it's a bubble, but I think London has special reasons why for students, in that case from China, they like to be here.
I think prime residential in London, and I think to partly answer your question, it certainly helps. We've done residential conversions of office buildings that they have been very successful, and as you say, it takes a bit of space out of the market. I'd like to see a more flexible approach from planners in the UK towards redundant retail space, and an obvious use for that would be edge of centre residential. We're just not very good at taking redundant space out of the market and converting it into something else, because the planning system really stacks the odds against that. I think if you look at experience elsewhere in Europe, certainly residential is a much more significant institutional market than it is in the UK. And the history here is that we're dominated by owner occupation. We haven't really cracked social housing as an institutional asset class, but I think that's an area that certainly deserves a lot of effort and attention. But experience elsewhere in Europe, it's a mainstream asset class in places like the Netherlands, through the Nordic region, certainly in Germany. We've been struggling, like many others, to launch funds over the last 2 or 3 years, but we have managed to launch new residential funds in both Germany and in Sweden just in the last year, and they've been quite well received, I think, by the market. And certainly Germany has a very big residential property fund sector, and quite a lively one. So not necessarily the saviour in the UK. I think there are things that are helpful to focus on that sector, but it's a mainstream asset class elsewhere.
Yeah, and we see the performance numbers for residential across the European markets. They've held up relatively well, and in the UK, where it's more the specialist funds that are investing in the residential market, private renter sector for last year was delivering returns of north of 11%. So that was competing, well, actually outperforming the central London office market. So strong rates of returns are being delivered, and obviously with the demographics, you would have thought the demand for those in that sector would clearly hold up.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of interest in residential transactions over the last couple of years. I think the only thing I'd say that we've seen more recently is a concern about the sustainability and volatility of high-end residential values. And then secondly, in terms of the mid-market type transactions, where I think people tend to be focusing at the moment, one or two concerns coming forward about the dangers of extrapolating from sort of general figures affecting the country, because it's very much a localised market. And if you actually look at London, there's a number of postcodes which haven't performed well, and others which have performed spectacularly. So you need to be in the right area. So there are some slight reservations there, but certainly we've seen a lot of interest in it. And again, in Germany, we've seen a lot of interest in multifamily investment, which is primarily an income play, where you can lock into an initial yield, and then because they're local regulatory controls over the upgrading of rent, you get an uplift over a fixed period of time. And I think the US funds who used to buy those, say, 5 or 6 years ago, sold them on an assumption that the occupiers would buy the properties and you could create an additional cash flow that way. And that proved not to be the case. But I think in the new Germany, I think there's a potential view that more Germans will start buying their homes because of a sort of Germanic concern about inflation. So.
Peter, are you, as an opportunistic, value add, are you looking at buildings that can potentially be
converted into residential?
Yeah.
Not really. We're not really a residential type developer, so I'm actually not sure the answer to that question. Don't know, but I do think that I have a sense that it may be a minority phenomenon. I mean, for instance, when you look at the large number of quasi-obsolete office space in Central Terrace in the Haussmannian buildings that were built to be residential buildings, then converted into offices, it would be logical to convert them back. But until office rents start falling more, which nobody here is predicting will happen, it only becomes economic to go through the expense of the conversion for the really top-end residential. So in individual locations, particular buildings, yeah. As a general trend, gosh, I would be surprised.